welcome to Humanities on the Road. Today we are at the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center in Pennsburg for Pennsylvania German Groundhog Lodges. I'm Tracy Matisak, and you know, Humanities on the Road is a collaboration between the Pennsylvania Humanities Council and PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network, and the idea is to bring people together from all over the state. We want to talk about history and the arts and all the important ideas that shape our world. Special thanks to our host today, the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center. And you know, this center is really one of Pennsylvania's gems. It is an archive, it's a library, it's a museum, it's a place where there are tours and exhibits and all kinds of workshops and special events. And the mission is to preserve and interpret the history of the Schwenkfelders and Perkiomen Valley. Now, if you live in any other part of Pennsylvania besides this, you may well be asking the question, what is a Schwenkfelder? And we're glad you've asked, because we want to talk about that a little bit today. The Schwenkfelders were a group that fled religious persecution in Europe in what is now modern-day Germany, and many of them settled in Pennsylvania. In fact, by the 1730s, there were about 200 or so in and around Montgomery County, and by 1782, there was a society of Schwenkfelders that was formed. They are the only spiritualist or mystic group that has roots in the Protestant Reformation that survives today. And this center, in addition to being the only internationally dedicated center for Schwenkfelder history, is a vast resource for genealogy for people who live in and around the Perkiomen Valley, and especially those who are of Pennsylvania German descent. And by the way, this institution has been collecting material since the 1880s, so you can imagine there is a lot of great stuff to be seen and to be learned here. Well, we want to introduce our special guest, our speaker for today, Bill Donner. Bill, of course, is a Commonwealth speaker with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He is also a professor of anthropology at Kutztown University with a PhD degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Bill is of Pennsylvania German descent, but he did not begin to research his heritage until he began to see a parallel between Polynesians and Pennsylvania Germans at home. Now, say that 4 times fast, first of all, and we're going to ask him about that during the program. He has edited a number of Pennsylvania German journals. He's the manager of performances at the Kutztown Folk Festival, and he is currently working on a publication about Pennsylvania German Groundhog Lodges, which conveniently is our topic for today. So Bill is going to share all that and much more with us during his presentation, so please join me as we welcome Bill Donner.
Okay. I got interested in a Pennsylvania German named Abraham Rieser Horn, who lived in the last century. He lived from 1834 to 1902, and he published a newspaper called the National Educator from 1860 to 1902. And I wanted to get a hold of this newspaper because it presented a Pennsylvania German view of education in Pennsylvania. And I went to the Lehigh County Historical Society. He died in Allentown, and they had a few years. I went to the Library of Congress. They had a few years. I went to the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, where he had studied and he left his papers. They had a few years. But Schwenkfelder had every year, 1860 to 1902, and it was really a wonderful resource, and David was a great help there. So it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm glad to be here. Also, this is a great area. People from outside may not know this, but this East Greenville, Pennsburg, Goshenhoppen, this is a wonderful area for Pennsylvania Germans. You have one Groundhog Lodge here, number 7. I'll talk a little bit about that. You have a ladies' Groundhog Lodge here as well, and I think I see Lucy Kern. And then we have the Goshenhoppen Festival. The Goshenhoppen historians are centered here as well. And if I could put a plug in, I think they meet, is it the first Friday and Saturday of every August? And you'll probably see one of the most, Saturday. You'll see one of the most authentic presentations of Pennsylvania German culture right here. So this is a great place to talk about the Groundhog Lodges, and I'm real happy to be here. All right, here we have Mr. Groundhog, and this is Lodge number 1 from 1971. And I want to point out, over in the lower right-hand corner is a much younger Don Breininger, and Don is a very popular speaker at the Groundhog Lodges. I like to start this story by telling something that came from a writer named Thomas Harder. And he wrote under the title of Boonesteal. And he wrote some newspaper columns in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I tell this story because it kind of sets up what I want to talk about in this talk. Harder was a newspaper man, and he took on the pseudonym of Boonesteele as, for his letters to himself, really. And he presented Boonesteele as a kind of down-to-earth, real hardcore Pennsylvania Dutchman. And oftentimes you see Boonesteele can be humorous and sometimes silly, but also has some insight and wisdom about human behavior. And I think it's real important to see how this kind of humor is oftentimes used in the Groundhog Lodges to give us insight from a common person's perspective. Anyway, the story, Boonesteele is actually the pseudonym for Thomas Harder. Thomas Harder's writing for himself. By the way, probably the most popular column in Pennsylvania German amongst Pennsylvania Germans. Harder was writing about 1900. He put it in the newspaper that he was the editor of, and then stopped after a month, and then all the subscribers wrote, "We're not going to continue our subscription unless you continue with Boonesteele." And so this is a story that comes out of Boonesteele. And I have several reasons to tell it. I'll explain a little bit later. There was a farmer and he had a son. And I have two boys, 12 and 15. He had a son maybe a little bit younger, about 11 or 12, and he wondered what that son was going to be when he grew up. And this is something I look at my sons, I say, how are they going to turn out? And he wanted to know what his son was going to be, and so he went to the pastor. Par is the word they use around here, but we'll call him a pastor. He went to his pastor and said, "Pastor, I have this boy, he's about 10 years old. I want to know, what do you think he's going to be when he grows up?" And the pastor scratched his beard and thought for a while. He said, "There's something I learned in seminary school. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take an apple, we'll take a silver dollar, we'll take a Bible, we'll put it in a room, we'll tell him to go in, and we'll see what he does. If he picks up the apple and eats it, we know he's going to be a farmer. If he puts the silver dollar in his pocket, he's going to be a banker. If he's reading the Bible, he's going to be a pastor." And the farmer thought, yeah, well, that makes sense. So they picked a day, they put the apple and the silver dollar and the Bible into a room, and then they led the boy into it, closed the door, waited a couple minutes, went back, and there was a little boy. He'd taken the silver dollar, put it in his pocket. He was reading the Bible and eating the apple. All right, well, the farmer turned to the pastor and said, "Well, okay, what now?" The pastor scratched his beard and said, "I think he's going to be a politician." And I tell this story because it has a kind of earthy humor to it that you find in Boonesteele. This is also the kind of humor, oftentimes with a point, that you find at the Groundhog Lodges. I also tell this because I have a lot to cover, and I don't want to be like a politician, say so much that I haven't said anything, so I'll try to keep myself focused. I also tell this because I think Harder's writing leads into as many things that were going on in the Groundhog Lodges. But that story actually was, though Harder wrote it in Pennsylvania German, that was part of a much larger kind of story you would have found in English language papers. And one of the things I think you have to understand about the Pennsylvania Germans and the Groundhog Lodges and many things they do, they are Pennsylvania German, they're somewhat different, but they're also part of a much broader American process. And I think I'll try to show how they're both uniquely Pennsylvania German, but also very clearly part of a broader American process. Culture is being created. We go back 1934 when the first Groundhog Lodge was met. This was something new. This had never been done before. And we had something which was created in 1934, and yet today I think if you ask most people to say Groundhog Lodges, Versammlings, those are traditional Pennsylvania German activities. And I want you to think about the fact that we have a way of expressing Pennsylvania German culture which doesn't go back to Germany, doesn't even go back to 1683 or 1808 or wherever you want to cut the line for Pennsylvania Germans. It's something that was created in the 20th century. And one thing as an anthropologist I can tell you, oftentimes we see traditions being created, especially in rapidly modernizing societies. And that actually is the Polynesian Connection, Tracy, that all over the world people are experiencing culture change. Try to deal with what's happening to their way of life and their tradition. And oftentimes what they do is create traditions which are very meaningful. And that's what I find fascinating about the Groundhog Lodges. Okay, this is, I think he's 8 foot, but I think maybe looks more like 10 feet, papier-mâché Groundhog Lodge that appears at number 1. 1971, they used to wheel them in, but since then what they've done is actually put them up at the front. And this was the first meeting, 1934. They had such a big turnout that actually they oversold their tickets, and then they had to move to a larger hall the next year. We'll talk about how this idea came up, but a guy named William Troxell, who's better known as Pumpernickel Bill, he was a newspaper columnist in the Pennsylvania German language for the Allentown Call, and he thought there should be a time when Pennsylvania Germans would come together and just speak in the language. And this is the first meeting, and it was a wild success. This is something called the ROD, or the Overseeing Board of Lodge Number 1. This is their second year. The first year they actually ate groundhog. Did anybody here ever eat groundhog? We got a couple. That was actually a meal in this area. If it's cooked right, I'm told it's actually palatable, if not tasty. The first year they had groundhog. The second year they had buffalo. And more recently it's more chicken and ham and sausage, a more standard kind of fare. But in the early years they did this. And the ROD was a board that kind of organized the meetings. One thing that's interesting is they decided the ROD, the board, should have 13 members. And that's so nobody would think the Pennsylvania Germans are superstitious. There's a lot of play here on Pennsylvania Germans and what outsiders might think about them. And you can see these are a couple placards from Lodge Number 1. There's the birth certificate, and 1933 is when Pumpernickel Bill had his first meeting. He had about 5 or 10 people come meet at his house. He talked about his idea for having these groundhog lodges, an event where only Pennsylvania German is spoken. And they planned the meeting, and then 1934 was when they actually had the first meeting. And then you can't speak English. And if you do speak English at these meetings, I think in the old days you were fined a nickel. Now I think it's up to $1. It's pretty expensive sometimes if they ask me to speak at the lodge meetings. But English is not spoken. This is to be a Pennsylvania German event. And this is the program from Lodge Number 1. And the first meeting that they had, this was the first meeting of the Groundhog Lodges. You can see it was in the Republican Club, though I actually thought most of the Dutchmen were Democrats. But anyway, they met at the Republican Club in Northampton, and then they had to move it, I think, to the Masonic Lodge in Allentown because they had so many people. This is the program, and the reason why I show this is I want to show you how the lodge meetings are set up and how they go. This is from 1934. This is the first one, actually pretty similar today. This is the model that was used, and there are 17 other lodges throughout southeastern Pennsylvania, and then scores of things called versammelings. Those are gatherings which follow pretty much the same format. The difference is groundhog lodges, only men. Versammelings, you can have both men and women. But what you oftentimes have, people sing this America in Pennsylvania German. Oftentimes there's a prayer in Pennsylvania German. At the Groundhog Lodge meetings, there may be some oath in Pennsylvania German to follow the groundhog's rules, like eat sauerkraut and pork and things like that. And then you may have some songs, usually, not always, but usually English songs translated into Pennsylvania German. Usually there's some food, and then oftentimes there's some talks. And it depends. Sometimes there's one major speaker who will speak. Sometimes you have 2 speakers, a more humorous one and a more serious one. At this one, Edwin Fogel, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, gave a fairly serious talk, and then there was a more humorous talk that was given, and then oftentimes a skit. And actually the skit here was about the Groundhog Lodge, and if you look over there, you can see down in the middle there, T.R. Brendel, that was Thomas Brendel. He was a Reformed pastor, and he wrote the skit about Groundhog, and the problem was a group of people were trying to get Groundhog to give his prediction, but he didn't want to come out of the ground because his tail had been shot off the last year by one of the people that was standing waiting for him. So it's sometimes humorous. And then usually there's a pledge at the end. These are some of the songs back translated from English into Pennsylvania German. Occasionally some songs that were composed in Pennsylvania German, occasionally, very rarely, a couple German songs that have been moved into Pennsylvania German. But for the most part, American English language songs into Pennsylvania German. This is one from about 5 years ago, and you can see pretty much the same setup. This was a kind of format that really seemed to work for Pennsylvania Germans. And as I said, after 1934, it really spread. A lot of people got this idea. I don't know if you know the little town of Bowers. It's not too far from where I teach at Kutztown. It's one church. In 1938, they had a Pennsylvania German Versammlung where they spoke in Pennsylvania German, sang songs, actually followed this kind of model. It became very popular at that time. This is the way they always end one of their meetings with these words. This is actually the back of a program, and I think the Versammlings use this as well. And if I can just translate it into